So shall we start?
Sure. Shoot first, please.
Chapter 2, future of the book, and we're going to talk about NetZero. Maybe after lunch we might be a little bit sleepy. I know I had a glass of wine. Who in the audience knows what NetZero is? Hands up. If you think you know what NetZero is. Okay. Because it's a pretty complicated, topic in itself. So maybe we start with the basics. So we're talking about books and we're talking about storytelling. So I think this story really does have an interesting evil villain here, and that happens to be humans. Essentially, what we need to do by 2030 is to cut our carbon emissions as a global community by 50%. Now that's huge, it's massive. And what we need to do, because we know climate change is happening. I don't know how many of you might be feeling a bit warm today. Maybe a few weeks ago I heard it was also quite warm, or maybe you've experienced extreme weather in terms of floods, wildfires, or any other flooding, for example. Climate change now affects every region in every part of the world. It's one of the biggest challenges that we have to overcome, and it's a global ambition. And NetZero basically just says that all the greenhouse gases, that includes carbon, but it also includes things like methane and hydrocarbons, to reduce as much as possible to zero. And then any residual left over needs to be absorbed by what they call carbon removal technology, which is a really fancy word for a tree or the oceans. But there are other sort of technical solutions around that as well. And so that's what we have to do. We have to kind of think about carbon, we have to think about greenhouse gases, have to try and reduce it as much as possible, and then we have to make sure that we have the available carbon sinks, the available forests and oceans to absorb any of the residual. And so that's kind of the place that we got now. And what you often hear, maybe if you're purchasing a pair of sneakers or maybe a towel, you'll start seeing carbon neutral or sustainable written on things. And when we talk about that, what we're talking about is just carbon. And there, what you can do as an organization is look at your carbon, kind of reduce it, and then any of your residual, you offset it. And this is slightly different because offsetting means that you are investing in a project which may or may not extract carbon from the atmosphere. So that's a little bit different to NetZero. And not to get into too many technical details, but carbon neutrality means that you'll be able to invest in a project which might be stimulating renewable energy, or it might be about protecting the forests. But that's not necessarily going to get us to that NetZero goal. So if you go home with just one little fact in your head, I would say the main goal that we have to do for climate action is to reduce by 50% by 2030. Now this is a bit of a challenge, I have to say, because every year our carbon emissions go up and up. We haven't peaked, so we haven't quite cracked the nut here about it. And no industry or sector escapes the reality of a rapid decarbonisation. So cement, huge issue, glad I'm not working in cement. But also, fast fashion and publishing, not to put them into the same category, but they are basically also needing to decarbonize as well. And we have to start thinking about what that means. And in terms of businesses and how we might account for that, there is lots of different terminologies, lots of very complicated things that you can do around it called scopes. But to not go into all the details, what I can say is that you can, in your business operations, start thinking about what you can directly change. So this is the light bulbs in your office. This is the cars you drive. These are your, whether you decide to print that email or not. All of those little tiny things that you can do all make a difference, and that's your direct emissions. Then you have indirect emissions, which is all your suppliers. Everybody that you have throughout your value chain have to also decarbonize, and we also have to account for those. So there's these two big buckets, which is direct and indirect. But I'm on stage here with António, who is also a big paper manufacturer, who has had a lot of experience in looking at it from a business perspective. So maybe, António, you want to share some thoughts about how businesses are looking at this?
I will. Actually, there are good news, because books are one way to decarbonize in the end. Paper books, I mean. Decarbonization is for sure the biggest challenge of our generation, and most likely the next generation as well. And there is a debate, and building on what you have said, Rachel, and also on the previous speaker, there is always this view of paper books versus e-books. And I'd like to touch on that on the angle of decarbonization, but eventually enlarging the scope of the discussion, because decarbonization, no matter how important it is, might be a short-sighted view on the issues of environment. So let's try a quick comparison in between the two. A paper book is made out of a renewable resource, forests. And forests grow, forests that are typically planted for that purpose. In the majority of the world, I will not say in all the world, but in the large majority of the world, for sure in Europe, most likely in Latin America, for sure in North America. I have doubts if this is true in Asia, but in those regions, forests that are used for the production of books are planted forests for that purpose. And forests, while they are growing, they are sequestrating, they are fixing CO2. So a book, in the end, fixes CO2. So the nice thing, you probably want to share the example of your book. Your book, the production of your book has emitted CO2, but at the same time, the book, while it lives on the shelves, it lives on these glamorous libraries that were mentioned before, it stores CO2. And the good news is that typically books are not very, a good stream for recycling papers. Other graphic paper applications, newspapers, magazines, office papers, they are usually recycling more often. Books, we tend to keep books for long. And as long as we keep books, we store CO2 on the books. Let's move to e-books. By the way, digital technology has been and will be an ally of the printing industry, of the paper industry, of the publisher. So this dichotomy in between digital and conventional paper books is probably a bit far-fetched. We see them as ally, and they will keep on being two allies delivering the same benefits for the end user. But they are very different in nature. There is a study, this is the only study that I know is published by a Norwegian institute. This study tries to compare the carbon footprint of e-books with the carbon footprint of paper books. And the study is relatively simple, says the following. Paper books have a carbon footprint that is 10 times lower, I repeat, 10 times lower than web-based books if read on an e-reader or a laptop, and 30 times lower if it is web-based books read on a desktop with a screen. So this is published, you can Google it. It's a Norwegian graphical institute that has developed this study. But I think it doesn't stop here, because e-books emit significantly more than paper books, but they don't store. And the paper book stores carbon while it's live. And I probably hand over to you to explain your concept, if you will.
Sure. So when we talk about carbon footprints, it might sound a bit strange, but you need to kind of think about a book as a series of processes, and we somehow need to calculate the carbon in each of these processes. And we started a project under the steering of the International Publishers Association, Federation of European Publishers, and many others, and we called it the Publishing 2030 Accelerator, 2030 key date, 50% reduction. And what we had to do there is that we were thinking about what do we do, how do we account for it? And within 2 months, we had our first prototype, which is my little book here. And on the back, we've got the first little printing of the CO2 associated with this. Now, it's not really about the label. The label's super interesting. Come up, scan it. It's super cool on your mobile. But it's more about what the process, what categories are there, right? So we talk about content creation. Think about the energy that an author might take in order to write a book. That has to be part of it. Paper, very important. We need to think about what kind of emissions we're going to calculate around paper. We talk about retail and distribution. We also talk about end of life. The consumer has a place. If you keep the book, you can keep the carbon. If you decide to not recycle it in the right way, that also isn't very helpful. And so the whole project and what we're starting to think about also for Portugal is how we might be able to take that methodology and apply it, because then we can start driving and identifying which is the biggest area. If you're looking at a book and you say, it doesn't really matter if it's going to be 4 kilos or 5 kilos, who knows, right? What does that mean? What it does mean is that is 50% of that footprint on paper? Is it 50% on the printing? Is it 50% on the distribution? And if so, what could you be doing to maybe drive that down a little bit? And then we start seeing behavior driving. And I think that's really key, that we have to think about the future. And I think, maybe, and I'm looking at the clock, we don't have that much time. But as we've just heard from Maria, books are not fast fashion. Books are literally going to be the foundation of our societal fabric. The books are able to bring our polarization together. When you think of climate action or any crisis, it's a crisis of storytelling. And what that means is that we need our poetry, our comedy, our education books, our textbooks, and also the fantastic fiction and escapism to start reflecting climate change as much as what we are seeing right now. I was listening to a really great podcast who said, if you're reading a story about the future which doesn't have an extreme weather somehow in the plotline, that's pretty much science fiction. We're already warmed up to 0.2 degrees. So what can we do as publishers? What can we do to make sure that we are going to get the best skills for our children? How do we make sure that if you're going to spend a bit of carbon as an individual, it's going to be on a book? It's not just about the price, it's also about that carbon impact. And it deserves to be spent. We talked about owning our emissions, and I think I would own my emissions if it's a great book that's going to enhance my life, and really I'm going to keep it and love it and treasure it. I think I've even got workbooks from when I was at school that my mum had kept, they are such a rich fabric. And I think that idea of content as well as the operational side, so 2 areas that we could really think of as a publishing industry and for the next generation of books.
I would like to build on that. It's very important that the publishing industry find out the common standard to calculate the carbon footprint of books and e-books, and as well to demonstrate the amount of carbon that is captured on a paper book. But the comparison in between paper books and e-books goes beyond the concept of carbon footprint. Is more, if you will, a concept of environmental footprint. If you look to a paper book, paper in Europe is one of the materials that is more recycled. More than 70%, 72 to 74% of paper in Europe is recycled. If we compare to the materials that constitute an e-reader, a computer, is 17%. So the recyclability of paper is significantly higher than the recyclability of an e-reader or a computer. The other important thing about paper books is that forest provides a set of ecosystem services that go beyond the paper, the forest products, and the CO2 sequestration. The forest itself is a water cycle regulation. We don't have a water cycle regulation without forest. Is soil erosion prevention. Is biodiversity. In our own company, we have registered, cataloged, and protected 1,100 different species on our forests. So forest is biodiversity as well. Forest creates a social network to fix populations in rural areas where very often there is no other economical use for their activities. So let's not look only to carbon footprint, let's look to recyclability, and let's look also to the aspects of the ecosystem services that forests provide. But again, on the comparison in between the advantages and disadvantages of paper books versus e-books, we should also look to, if you will, what neuroscience and psychology tells us. Neuroscience and psychology tells us that learning process through paper books is significantly deeper, the retention is higher, the comprehension of abstract concepts or difficult concepts is higher in a paper book than in an e-book. So it's very important also that legislators, when we speak about books that we can buy in a bookshop, and they are not regulated, so to say, is our free will. We can decide if we want a paper book or if you want an e-book, and each one is free to decide whatever he finds suitable for their needs and their patterns of consumption. However, when regulation comes, namely if regulation comes to school books, it's very important that the legislator understands that legislating in favor of e-books versus paper books will have implications on generations. You probably all know the declaration of Stavanger from early 2019, where 100 researchers and scientists clearly explained that there are risks of a learning system that is purely based on digital. So it's very important that the legislators, they recognize the scientific advantages and what science tells us about e-books and paper books, and they do not rule only based on ideology or only based on cost drivers. So it's very important that legislators look as a whole through this theme, and the cost of having a generation that is purely educated on e-books is probably too high for a country like Portugal to pay. So I think it's important also publishers, everybody in the room, to recognize this and to work to make sure that we don't allow our children, our grandchildren, to be jeopardizing their education system. Last comment. This eventual move from paper books to e-books is going to be worst on the divide in between the public education system and the private education system. If you look to the major schools, both in America, I don't have time, but I could explain a work that we have done, our company has done at the Stanford University in the USA. If you look to North America, if you look to Europe, the best schools, the elite schools, they are migrating away from an education purely based on digital devices to develop an education based on paper. Again, paper and digital are allies, but when it refers to retention of information, knowledge, apprehension of concepts, paper, besides all the other environmental advantages, is by far better.
I think the main point is that we want people to read. We want the books to be produced, but we also want them to be read, because a book that's not read is a complete waste. So I think, we've gone through a lot of different aspects here. We've covered what NetZero is, but I think the science, and I think we'll both finish on the scientific basis, is that we have to do something. Today is the day that we have to start acting, and it might seem very big, but you can go home tonight and you can really think about calculating your own carbon footprint for your personal life. Think about what that might mean. Read up on NetZero, really pay attention to those climate articles, and start really thinking about how it might work for your organization or your library or your area that you work in. And write it on the whiteboard out in there, because climate action is really where it is. And I think books, publishing are going to be fundamental to society's ability to deliver the sustainable future we all deserve.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.